and it's from the pelvic cavity of a skeletised corpse that was buried some 100-odd years ago. Found it quite easily.
And Madeleine was reported missing on May the 3rd, 2007. And I always say reported missing because we don't know that was exactly when she went missing.
I've tried to move on, my family's tried to move on, but it's always something that I'm linked to. Whenever there's anything that's new, my name gets mentioned in it. So I'd like to see it resolved.
The German prosecutor investigating the disappearance of Madeleine McCann 18 years ago has told the BBC that his chief suspect...
I don't believe them. I'm not saying that much, but I'm saying for sure they had their involvement in this operation.
Do you seriously think that the British government would allow its agents to cover up a major crime?
Well, I'm not British, so I can't answer that.
The evening air was still over Praia da Luz when the dogs began to bark. Their names were Eddie and Kayla, two of the most elite cadaver dogs in Britain with impeccable records. What they sensed inside apartment 5A was not guesswork. It was not speculation. It was the unmistakable trace of death. First, behind the living room sofa, then again in the wardrobe. Days later, the same alert resounded inside the trunk of a car rented by the McCanns, weeks after their daughter disappeared. Eddie barked furiously, each sound echoing like a verdict, and yet somehow the world turned away. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world.
Experience and the training of the dog. What I first noticed is that as soon as I came in, that the dog's very excited, and as a handler I can pick up his body language, etc. And it would appear to me that as soon as he's come in the house, he's picked up a scent that he recognises.
85 days have passed since little Madeleine McCann disappeared in front of millions. The innocent face on a poster, the subject of tearful press conferences, a missing child torn from her bed by an unknown predator.
If you have seen a little girl who looks like this, or if you see a little girl who looks like this, please contact the police immediately. Please don't hesitate, just contact them straight away.
But to the investigators, those sharp, urgent, relentless barks hinted at a darker story. And that's where the conflict began, because there were not one but two stories shaping this case. Two parallel realities, both vying for dominance, each carrying not just a vision of what happened, but a vision of the truth itself. The official version is simple. A 3-year-old was abducted in the night while her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, were having dinner a few feet away with friends. It was the story that the BBC reported, that Sky News reported, that Oprah and Barbara Walters reported.
3-year-old child who went missing while on holiday in May 2007 in Portugal. Her family and their friends had gone there for a May holiday. There was 9 adults, a bunch of toddlers, Madeleine and her twins. And Madeleine was reported missing on May the 3rd, 2007. And I always say reported missing because we don't know that was exactly when she went missing.
A story amplified by celebrity endorsements from J.K. Rowling to David Beckham, and sealed by a blessing from the Pope himself.
A little girl called Maddie was taken from the family hotel room in the Algarve in southern Portugal. As I'm sure you understand, we need to do everything possible to help the police with their inquiries in finding her.
Kate's cuddle cat, clutched tightly in trembling hands, became a symbol of maternal grief. Their anguished faces, broadcast across Europe and America, stirred millions in donations. The message was clear. This was every parent's nightmare, and the McCanns were victims of unspeakable cruelty. But there was another story, a quieter one, smothered almost as soon as it emerged. It came from Gonçalo Amaral, the Portuguese detective who first led the case. Amaral had spent nearly 3 decades investigating violent crime. He was not new to tragedy. Yet in Madeleine's disappearance, he saw patterns that did not align with a taking. The dogs, the contradictions in statements, the unlocked doors, the washed toy that had once carried Madeleine's scent. Amaral claimed the case was less about a kidnapping and more about concealment. For saying so, he was branded incompetent, biased, even villainous.
Nos próximos 50 minutos, vou provar que a criança não foi raptada e que morreu no apartamento de férias na Praia da Luz.
He said plainly, "This story is no longer about a missing child. It is about dignity, about whether truth still matters in a world where perception is everything." His words, heavy with defiance, cut to the heart of the case. Because if he was wrong, he had hounded grieving parents and destroyed his own career for nothing. But if he was right, then the greatest missing child investigation in modern history had ignored the very evidence that mattered most. Here lies the question that divides the world to this day. Was Amaral a stubborn detective clinging to a broken theory? Or was he the only one who dared to follow the trail, no matter how devastating the destination? For the McCanns, the official narrative kept Madeleine alive in the public imagination. It ensured constant coverage, financial support, and political backing at the highest levels of government. But critics argued that the polished media machine created an untouchable image, shielding the family from the kinds of questions investigators would normally ask. When Kate washed Cuddle Cat, tabloids whispered about destroyed evidence. When Gerry spearheaded a global PR campaign, police quietly complained that media frenzy had compromised the search. Even DNA findings, ambiguous, contested, incomplete, were spun into damning headlines. Public opinion swung wildly between sympathy and suspicion. Meanwhile, Amaral paid a heavy price. He was removed from the case, sued for defamation, and condemned to silence by court order. His book argued Madeleine passed away in apartment 5A, and her parents orchestrated a cover-up. For this, he lost not just his career, but his health and family stability. Yet he insisted it was not vengeance but truth that compelled him. And so the case of Madeleine McCann became something more than a disappearance. It became a war of narratives, a test of how far perception, power, and media could shape the truth that the world accepts. Imagine for a moment the two versions playing side by side. On one screen, candlelight vigils, tearful pleas, and celebrities urging us to find Maddie.
Please, could you go to your local authorities or police and give any information that you have, any genuine information that you have? Please help us.
On the other, a detective disgraced alone, warning that the investigation had been steered away from its most damning leads.
Os primeiros sinais de morte vêm da família. Sinais mais exteriores, nós já tínhamos pensado nela, mas é a família que contrata.
Damning leads.
Os primeiros sinais de morte vêm da família. Sinais mais exteriores, nós já tínhamos pensado nela, mas é a família que contrata ex-coronel, ex-militar das forças militares da África do Sul, para com uma máquina milagrosa vir àquele local e encontrar o corpo da...
Both stories cannot be true, but both refuse to die. That is the enduring tragedy of Madeleine McCann. A child is gone, and instead of clarity, the world is left with competing realities. Amaral once said the McCanns would never escape their guilt. Not legal guilt, but the guilt of leaving 3 children alone in a foreign apartment night after night. Others argue no parent should endure the torment they have faced. Between these positions lies the haunting question: what truly happened in apartment 5A? 17 years later, there is still no answer. Only echoes. The echo of a mother's scream into the night. The echo of a media circus that consumed nations. And perhaps loudest of all, the echo of a dog's bark, sharp, insistent, and impossible to forget.
We screened the vehicles using the dog, and the only reaction we've had is to the car in the far corner. But what we have is a reaction from the dog over here, where his head's up in the air, and he's sent in the items that he's trained to find, and when we tie him down, he picks this up.
It begins not with screams or broken glass, but with stillness. Apartment 5A, the last place 3-year-old Madeleine McCann was seen alive, bore none of the chaos one expects when a child vanishes. There were no overturned chairs, no frantic scratches on the doorframe, no sign of desperate parents tearing apart the room in a frantic search. Instead, there was quiet, an eerie quiet that settled over neatly made beds, curtains drawn in awkward positions, and a soft toy placed just so beside a pillow. For Inspector Gonçalo Amaral, this silence was the first alarm. In more than 2 decades investigating violent crimes, he had witnessed what real panic looked like. Parents ripping apart furniture, screaming their child's name into the void. But here, on May 3, 2007, the first words were not cries of, "Where is she?" but a chillingly certain declaration. She's gone. They've taken her. To Amaral, that certainty felt rehearsed, as if the narrative was already set before the evidence had spoken. As investigators turned to the scene itself, the cracks deepened. Much of the world would come to believe the story of a window forced open by an intruder, a stranger slipping silently into the children's bedroom. But forensic reality told a different story. There were no pry marks, no scratches on the frame, no signs of tampering on the shutters. They could only be opened from the inside. And the only fingerprints identified on the pane belonged to Kate McCann.
It's quite possible that that window was opened from the inside by a burglar so that they could get out that way if somebody came in through the other door.
The window, just 91 centimeters from the floor, should have carried some trace of an abductor climbing in or out, a footprint on the bed beneath it. Scuff marks on the wicker chair, pressed against the wall. Yet there was nothing. British investigators later remarked that the idea of a man carrying a child through that narrow opening was not just implausible, it was virtually impossible. The door showed no damage. The locks remained intact. No tool marks, no break-in, and so the conclusion formed the path of escape did not lead outward. It circled back, inside.
To make an exit route for yourself, to open the back door as well, so if somebody comes in the front door, you can just simply run out.
Then there was the condition of the room itself. Madeleine's pink blanket was so tidy it looked almost folded. The cuddle cat, the stuffed toy she was said to clutch for comfort every night, lay beside her pillow in a position too neat, too deliberate, as though it had been placed there, rather than dropped in restless sleep. To Amaral, these details whispered of staging a scene, arranged to tell a story. The voices of those closest to the McCanns that night, the so-called Tapas 7, emerged in testimony. Yet instead of reinforcing one another, their accounts fractured under scrutiny. Who had checked the children and when? Which doors had been opened? Which closed? Were the curtains billowing in the night breeze, or drawn tightly shut? Each telling shifted with time, details morphing as if molded to fit a larger narrative. Most troubling was Jane Tanner's account. At 9:15 p.m., she claimed she saw a man carrying a child in light-colored pajamas near the apartment.
Yeah, I was carrying sort of across the body like that. I suppose in hindsight you probably think somebody would carry them more against.
But Gerry McCann himself stood on the same narrow street at that very moment, speaking with another holidaymaker. Neither he nor the man beside him noticed anything unusual. And yet Tanner's story evolved over the weeks, her description becoming more vivid, even aligning suspiciously with Robert Murat, who would soon be named a suspect.
I've tried to move on, and my family's tried to move on, but it's always something that I'm linked to. Whenever there's anything that's new, my name gets mentioned in it. So I'd like to see it resolved.
To Amaral, the inconsistency was damning. She was lying, was his blunt, stark conclusion. The road, he argued, does not lead out of the apartment, it leads inward. For him, the absence of external traces suggested not a kidnapper's stealth, but an internal event, perhaps an accident later concealed. Supporting this were the movements inside the apartment itself. The sofa had been pushed hastily against the wall, crushing the curtains behind it. The cadaver dogs would later alert at that very spot, as well as inside the parents' bedroom and on their clothing. But if Amaral's suspicions were right, this was no longer the tale of a predator slipping through the night, but of something unspeakable occurring within those walls, something followed by a cover-up. To accept such a possibility was to question not only the official narrative, but the credibility of two parents presented to the world as victims. And it was to admit that from the very first hours, the investigation had been steered away from the evidence that mattered most. Complicating everything was the contamination of the scene itself. Before it was secured, neighbors, friends, and even resort staff streamed in and out of apartment 5A. Beds were touched, windows handled, and doors opened and closed. By the time police attempted a proper forensic sweep, the critical hours were already gone. One officer dusted the shutters for fingerprints without gloves. Samples were compromised, evidence eroded, and the trail irrevocably blurred. Still, contradictions remained stark. Kate McCann insisted the curtains had been fully closed, yet photographs showed tiebacks dangling in positions consistent with someone pulling them hurriedly. The group's notes, scribbled collectively on the back of Madeleine's sticker book before police arrived, suggested they had agreed on a version of events together. And when investigators requested a reconstruction to resolve discrepancies, the McCanns and their friends refused, dismissing the exercise as unnecessary. For Amaral, this refusal was not the act of innocent parents desperate for clarity. It was the act of people unwilling to test their story against reality. The storytelling of those days reveals two competing forces: a polished public relations campaign that placed Madeleine's face on newspapers across the globe, and a small cadre of investigators whispering that the evidence inside apartment 5A did not match the abduction narrative. Amaral's insistence on probing inward would ultimately cost him his career, his marriage, and even his health. He was vilified, sued, and cast out. Yet, he never recanted his belief that Madeleine had died in the apartment, and that what followed was a simulation designed to mislead. Nearly 2 decades later, the fracture remains. Officially, the case continues under theories of abduction, bolstered in recent years by German prosecutors, naming a convicted offender as their prime suspect.
Bei den Beschuldigten handelt es sich um einen mehrfach vorbestraften Sexualstraftäter, der unter anderem auch wegen sexuellen Missbrauchs von Kindern bereits verurteilt wurde. Derzeit verbüßt er in anderer Sache eine längere Haftstrafe. Der Beschuldigte lebte zwischen 1995 und 2007 regelmäßig an der Algarve, unter anderem einige Jahre in einem Haus zwischen Lagos und Praia da Luz.
But the early cracks Amaral identified have never fully closed. The window that showed no forced entry, the toy placed too neatly, the testimonies that shifted like sand, the refusal of a reconstruction, the stakes extend far beyond Praia da Luz. They touch the very notion of truth itself. Can a narrative, amplified by media power and political influence, outweigh physical evidence? Can perception erase the silence that greeted investigators inside apartment 5A? If so, then the disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not only one family's tragedy, but a warning of how stories can be shaped, curated, and believed while the facts remain buried in plain sight. The first cracks appeared in silence, a silence more haunting than screams, more damning than chaos. And in that silence lies the unresolved question: was this the perfect crime of a predator who vanished into the night, or the unspoken truth of a tragedy contained within 4 walls? It begins with silence, then a single bark, shatters the air. A sharp, decisive sound. Inside apartment 5A, Eddie, a cadaver dog with an unblemished record, has just alerted. His nose is pressed behind the sofa, his body rigid, his bark unwavering. He is telling the investigator something that no witness statement could. The scent of a deceased person lingers here. Moments later, in the very same spot, his partner, Keela, trained only to detect human blood, freezes, her nose pointed at the tiles, refusing to move. The two dogs, working independently, converge on the same truth. It's the moment the story changes from a missing child to something darker, far less hopeful. Eddie and Keela are not ordinary animals. Their reliability has been cited as upward of 90 to 95% in countless cases. Their alerts are not guesses. They are signals recorded on camera 13 times in total, each one inside spaces or on items linked directly to the McCann family. And yet, despite this, the world would later be told inconclusive. But before that narrative took hold, the dogs led investigators deeper into a labyrinth of unsettling discoveries. Behind the sofa, in the wardrobe of the parents' bedroom, on Kate McCann's clothing.
And it's from the pelvic cavity of a skeletised corpse that was buried some 100-odd years ago. Found it quite easily.
Even on Madeleine's soft toy, Cuddle Cat, the object she was rarely seen without. Then, most damning of all, in the trunk of the Renault Scenic hired by the McCanns, not at the time of the disappearance, but weeks later, Eddie barked frantically, his body language urgent, unmistakable. Keela, moments afterward, alerted to human blood in the same compartment. How could the scent of a deceased person and the trace of human blood follow this family into a vehicle Madeleine was never known to enter alive? The samples were collected. Tiles from the apartment, swabs from the car, hairs, fibres, and even the key to the Renault itself. All were rushed to the UK's Forensic Science Service, FSS, in Birmingham. Investigators in Portugal waited, convinced this was the scientific proof that would finally anchor the dog's findings. And at first, the news looked devastating. Preliminary reports whispered of a high correlation, 17 out of 19 genetic markers matching Madeleine. But then came the silence, the walk back, the word that would soon echo in headlines worldwide: inconclusive. Dr. John Lowe of the FSS admitted the sample from the Renault Scenic was too complex to interpret, too many contributors, too little material. He acknowledged he could see elements consistent with Madeleine's DNA, but he refused to draw a conclusion. Instead, he placed the data in limbo, stripped of certainty. To the McCann's legal team, it was a lifeline. To the Portuguese police, it was a betrayal. And to the public, it became another layer of confusion in an already impenetrable case. But the science, some argue, was not the problem. The interpretation was. Later reviews revealed that the FSS simply lacked the computational tools to unmix complex DNA mixtures. Cybergenetics, a Pittsburgh-based lab, claimed their true allele system could have analyzed the data with clarity, producing matched statistics instead of evasive shrugs. They even offered to do it for free. Their conclusion: the DNA was not meaningless. It could well have been Madeleine's. The government just never allowed the reanalysis. Because this isn't just about a family car or a bloodstain. It's about what happens when forensic truth collides with political pressure, international diplomacy, and the desperation of a narrative too entrenched to be challenged. If the dogs were right, if the DNA could have been confirmed, then the entire global perception of the case collapses. No longer the tragic fairy tale of a child stolen from her bed by a faceless predator, but a crime of concealment. A death that occurred not in the shadows outside the apartment, but within its walls. and a cover-up aided not just by those involved, but perhaps by institutions too reluctant to face the scandal of the truth. Storytelling now turns to the contradictions. Police reports documented how no other apartments, cars, or belongings triggered alerts, only those connected to the McCanns. Explanations were floated: dirty diapers, rotten meat, garbage. Yet Eddie and Keela had worked hundreds of cases without ever confusing such odors with human remains. Their handler, Martin Grime, was clear. These dogs only alert when they are sure. And it's from the pelvic cavity of a skeletonized corpse that was buried some 100-odd years ago. We found it quite easily. Still, critics persisted. Cadaver dogs, they said, are not admissible in court. Their alerts must be corroborated. And when the DNA came back muddy, the narrative shifted again. Media outlets framed Amaral, the lead investigator, as a disgraced figure chasing ghosts. The McCanns, meanwhile, were recast as victims of an inept police force, their innocence reinforced by the convenient, inconclusive stamp. But Amaral never forgot what he saw. To him, the science was not ambiguous. The path, though obscured, still led inward, not outward. The road does not lead outside the apartment, he later wrote. It leads back inside. And what of the missing DNA from Madeleine's personal effects? No traces on her toothbrush, her pillow, her everyday belongings. An absence that struck Amaral as far more telling than any partial result. It was as if the evidence of her life had been erased, leaving only faint, stubborn traces of her passing. The narrative then widens. Millions spent, international appeals, suspects paraded through headlines only to be discarded. And yet the one set of results that seemed to point consistently toward an answer, the dogs and the forensic traces they uncovered, was filed away under uncertainty. Was this incompetence, or was it deliberate? Did the case collapse under the weight of flawed science, or was it quietly steered away from the truth to protect reputations, relationships, and political convenience? 17 years later, the footage still chills. Eddie's bark echoing in the dim apartment, Keela frozen, nose pressed to the tiles, the trunk of the Renault Scenic vibrating with the frantic energy of two dogs, certain they had found what humans could not. For investigators, this was the moment the case cracked open. For the public, it remains the moment the story grew darker, heavier, and infinitely more tragic. Because if these dogs were right, if the DNA could have been properly resolved, then the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was never about a person who took her at all. It was about a passing, a concealment, and the lengths to which people, and perhaps entire systems, will go to deny the evidence barking at their very door. It begins not with chaos, but with silence, a silence so unusual that it etched itself into the memory of the first detective through the door. Gonçalo Amaral, a veteran with nearly 3 decades of experience, would later recall the stillness of apartment 5A. No overturned furniture, no frantic search, no signs of a break-in, only the quiet assertion uttered almost immediately by the parents. She's gone. They've taken her. Amaral found himself struck not just by what he saw, but by what he didn't. In cases of missing children, he had grown used to the rawness of panic, parents tearing apart rooms, screaming for their child, collapsing in despair. But here he observed something different, an eerie composure, statements more rehearsed than frantic, words delivered like conclusions rather than questions. For Amaral, this silence was not absence. It was evidence.
What I like to say is that she looks like Kate, but she's got a McCann personality. And if you've seen the rest of my family, yeah, she's loud and she's a real extrovert. And the
official story broadcast within hours was one the world found easy to believe. A 3-year-old snatched from her bed while her parents dined nearby. It fit a familiar narrative, one that explained everything and blamed no one inside the walls of apartment 5A.
Some more breaking news for you this morning. We're just hearing that a search is underway for a 3-year-old British girl who's gone missing in the Algarve area of Portugal, and she went missing last night. Hundreds of people have been searching for the girl.
Yet Amaral could not reconcile that tale with what the scene itself revealed to him. The cracks appeared immediately, and over time, those cracks would form the foundation of the theory that defined his career and nearly destroyed it. At the heart of Amaral's hypothesis is a tragic accident. One possibility he outlined: Madeleine, waking in the unfamiliar darkness, climbed onto the living room sofa to peer through the window, perhaps searching for her parents. In that small act of curiosity, she slipped, falling into the narrow gap between sofa and wall, a fatal blow to the head, a sudden loss of life. In an instant, the spot behind that sofa, chillingly, was precisely where cadaver and blood detection dogs would later alert. Both animals, trained independently, signaled the presence of death and human blood at that location. But Amaral also entertained another possibility, equally grim: that Madeleine, restless, wandered toward the balcony outside her parents' bedroom. The railing was low, the vegetation beneath obscured, and the ground uneven. A misstep, a fall from height, and the outcome could have been catastrophic. Though the evidence behind the sofa was stronger, the balcony theory explained other anomalies: why the dogs also reacted in the garden, and why traces of potential blood were later recovered from the outdoor tiles and climbing plants. In either version, the ending was the same: a fatal accident. And yet, for Amaral, what followed was more disturbing than the accident itself, because in his eyes, what began as tragedy transformed swiftly into concealment. He pointed to subtle but powerful indicators: the children's unusual sleep that night, even as chaos unfolded around them. 2 toddlers, undisturbed by noise, remaining in deep slumber as if sedated. Some investigators, noting this, speculated about Calpol Night, a common over-the-counter medicine in Britain that, at the time, contained an antihistamine known to cause drowsiness. Amaral believed the use of such medication could have made an accident fatal, turning what might have been survivable into something irreversible. And so, he argued, the McCanns faced an unbearable dilemma. To admit that Madeleine had died in their care, whether through a fall or a mistake involving sedation, would mean exposing not only their negligence, but their very professions. 2 doctors, champions of public health, suddenly guilty of losing a child through recklessness. In Amaral's mind, their careers, reputations, and lives as they knew them would be ruined. The motive, then, was not malice. It was survival. From there, Amaral reconstructed what he believed unfolded. First came the staging. The open window in Madeleine's room, complete with its shutters raised, gave the impression of intrusion. Yet no fingerprints other than Kate McCann's were found on the frame. No tool marks, no sign of forced entry. Amaral believed this was a deliberate tableau, designed to support a story of abduction. Then came the crafting of a unified narrative. Witnesses later reported that the group of friends, the so-called Tapas 7, had huddled together, writing notes and aligning timelines even before police arrived. Their later statements, Amaral pointed out, often shifted with inconsistencies about who checked the children at what time and by which door they entered. One sighting in particular, the account of Jane Tanner, who described a man carrying a child in pajamas, became more elaborate as weeks passed, morphing until it seemed to fit the features of an innocent local man, Robert Murat. To Amaral, these contradictions were not human error. They were deliberate attempts to shore up a fragile narrative. But the story did not stop at staging. Amaral believed there was also movement of a body. He cited the testimony of the Smith family, Irish holidaymakers, who described seeing a man uncannily resembling Gerry McCann carrying a child in his arms around 10 p.m., precisely the time the alarm was raised. The man, they said, looked uncomfortable, his head bowed, his pace hurried. Though this sighting was never pursued with vigor by British authorities, Amaral considered it crucial. To him, it suggested that Madeleine's body was removed quickly from the apartment that very night. Considering the theories of an accident and a subsequent concealment, how do you feel about the idea that what began as a tragic accident could escalate into a crime of a different nature? If you were tasked with solving this case, what specific new evidence would you seek out to either prove or disprove Amaral's theory? Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.